So it's time to turn our attention to the newspapers. Here with me to review them this morning are the anthropologist Mariana Hotter and the journalist and author Janelle Aldred. So welcome back to both of you. And we're going to dive inside the papers this hour. We dealt with a few of the front pages last time around, but Janelle, you've picked out a double-page spread in the Daily Mirror, which has got a fantastic picture of Rishi Sunak visiting a hospital, and there is a woman literally wagging her finger at him.
Yeah, she told him to try harder when it comes to nurses' pay, and I think that's something that many of us and many people agree with. 79% of people believe there are not enough nurses to deliver safe NHS care, and that's something that we should all be concerned about. Now, the service was on its knees before COVID, but the Tories have been in power for over a decade now, so this deep austerity that they love, mainly because I think a lot of them don't feel the pinch, I think it has put the NHS in a really, really tricky situation. And so pay up PM is the phrase, really, because in March the MPs, with wailing and gnashing of teeth, will take their annual pay rise, and they had a pay rise last year, and it's set by an independent standards authority, which is funded by the Treasury, and their budget's approved by the Speaker of the House. So the tail's wagging the dog. So I think before we get to next March, the next financial year, I think people in the NHS really want to see what are the government going to be doing for nurses' pay, and that will be set against what they do for themselves next year.
It's a very tricky one, this one, Marianne, isn't it? Because I'm sure a lot of people will be hugely grateful for the care they always receive when they go to the NHS, but particularly during COVID and being such a tough time. And yet the government is going to have demands from every sector, isn't it, for increases in wages at a time when budgets are just so tight, and we've heard so much about tough decisions being needed.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we don't have a magic money tree. Fundamentally, I think growth has to be the basis of our future prosperity. But fundamentally, I agree with Janelle. Austerity is a political decision. One of the things that really struck me when the kind of commentary around Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's failed mini budget came out was that these were described as unfunded cuts. Well, they weren't unfunded in as much as they were going to borrow to fund them, and you could have the conversation around whether they were making the right kinds of tax cuts, certainly, but there's a certain point at which, that kind of old adage about you save up so you can spend it when the rainy day comes. Well, if there were a rainy day, it's absolutely monsoon season now, isn't it? We're in the midst of an energy crisis. There's huge global instability in terms of these kind of shifting global powers. We're still coming out of the kind of the fractures of COVID and the global pandemic and all the impacts on the global supply chains there. Whether you're a supporter or not, Brexit has had an impact that needs to be dealt with and factored into the system. And so fundamentally, maybe this is the time that actually we do need to borrow more money.
Okay.
And actually invest in public services, because when you undercut the teachers, the nurses, the social workers, the police, then the fabric of society starts to fall apart. It's not unsustainable.
And it is a huge debate of our time, isn't it, at the moment, and how different parties would approach it. So, but let's move on to an international issue, which I know, Marianne, that you wanted to talk about. This is, I'm not even sure which paper it is, it's the Telegraph, actually, but a lot of the papers will be covering these protests in Iran.
Well, that's the interesting thing. Not that many papers are, and you do have to burrow deep into the inside pages to find reporting about these protests that are now right across Iran and have been going on for 43 days since the death of a young woman called Mahsa Amini, who was murdered by the morality police in Iran because she wasn't wearing her hijab, her headscarf, correctly. This is quite an extraordinary moment in Iranian society, where there was initial unrest amongst people who perhaps might be the obvious candidates for protesting against the government. But now this has spread right across Iran, beyond Kurdish areas, and all sorts of people, older women, are baring their hair and cutting their hair in public. The report in the Telegraph today is that there's an increase in people walking up to clerics wearing turbans and knocking their religious headgear from their heads, which is a huge act of disrespect and would have been utterly, kind of appalling and terrifying in previous days. It's a huge act of courage and bravery to stand up against the government.
Yeah.
They've reported that they're going to put 900 people on trial. They're enacting a thing called preventative arrests. And in places where there are big protests, they're doing things like cutting off internet connectivity, so people are under kind of media blackouts. And it's extraordinary that people are still protesting, and I think the world's eyes do need to be on Iran, and I think our support needs to be with the Iranian people.
Yeah.
So it should be up the papers. It should be on the front pages.
Yeah, although of course very difficult to report from Iran at the moment as well. We should mention that. But yes, there as much coverage as possible. I agree. It's a very fascinating story, and really interesting to watch as it goes ahead. Let's move back to UK issues, Janelle, because you've picked out a story. I think it's the front page story actually in the Telegraph, and they pick up on it further inside as well. And this is about how Oxford and Cambridge select their students.
Yeah, so they're using a different metric, so to speak, and what they want to do is they don't just want to look at the best grades, so to speak, but they also want to look at grades relative to students in their own context and how they perform against their peers. You could say they're looking for all-rounded students and a culture fit, but to some people equality feels a bit like oppression. So some fee-paying schools are saying now the system is now biased against students that attend fee-paying schools. Now for me, I think it's very clear that a lot of students at fee-paying schools do have an extra advantage when it comes to filling in those forms, being able to show what they know and all of those things. And so the fact that now the system is a bit more rigorous, a bit more competitive, meaning that other state students will have more of an equal chance to get in, I don't think that they should see that as a bias against them. I think it's saying, okay, look, we want the brightest and the best. It's not just about grades, but it's also about students, how well-rounded they are, what they contribute to university. And I think that's brilliant, because we know that a lot of Oxford students have positions of power in our country. They run a lot of things, and actually they should reflect the whole of society. And going to a fee-paying school or not shouldn't be the only metric or metric that gives you an advantage.
Very quick thoughts on this, Marianne. I mean, some people might say, well, that's what grades are for, to be able to compare like with like. I mean, what do you think? Do you think it's better to go on grades alone or to delve deeper?
So, confession, I went to Oxbridge, I went to Emmanuel College in Cambridge, having come from a state school. And one of the things that really struck me was that not only did people who were coming from much wealthier backgrounds have all the additional advantages.
Sorry, very quickly, Marianne, we're running out of time.
Sorry, it needs to be much more nuanced, because it's not just about grades, it's about the rounded person, where they're coming from, but also when they get there, they need the support so that they don't feel like a massive fish out of water.
Okay, brilliantly summarised. Thanks very much indeed, Marianne and Janelle. I'll see you again next hour. Thank you.